He was very polite and quiet.
Every time he would come over, he was polite.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to look at where Brian is likely to be found by going through what Gabby's parents say about him and also what a high school friend says about him. I'll put links to the source material, 60 Minutes Australia and The Sun in the description. The longer Brian remains missing without a trace, the more folks will try to make sense of that by saying that Brian is no longer alive. Go ahead. I'm sure it will suit Brian to a T for people to say that, because if that sort of thing catches on, the search for him is likely to cool off. I don't think it's any coincidence that the only quote-unquote helpful thing Brian's parents have contributed, arguably, is this notion that Brian Laundrie might hurt himself. It sort of plays into this whole idea that he may harm himself, and then, well, if you never hear from him, well, where is he? But there are a few good reasons to think that Brian may be quite comfortable in the fugitive/invisible man role. One reason is because he's been there before. He's been an outcast. He doesn't have friends. So he's not going to have a hard time hiding out and being on his own. It won't be as hard a time doing that as most people would experience that. Did you know that Bizarre Brian had plans on living outside of the US since high school? Well, that's something we're going to deal with in this episode. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. You can click on the light blue icon on the bottom right of your screen, like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. As a creative artist, Brian can keep himself busy reading, drawing, or writing. He's inner directed, not outer directed. And also in the 60 Minutes documentary, you hear Gabby's parents saying that Brian would even read to, I think, their youngest daughter or some other child of theirs at bedtime. So you do get the sense that he was someone who read a lot. But what about something else? What about movies? But if we come back to this idea of Brian not wanting to live, well, I think there's quite a lot for him to live for. I think he's getting a massive kick from seemingly this whole idea of outsmarting everyone, right? Why? Because he has, I think, contempt for the world systems as it is, and this is a way of driving his point home. And do you remember what he wrote on August 13th, the day after the notorious Moab incident? And he wrote this in Moab, and he wrote it about this juniper tree growing in this sort of very thin soil in the Arches area, and he actually posed right next to it. And you got a sense of reverence, of admiration from Brian for this humble plant growing and using so few resources. And it prompted him to write this message. He wrote, quote, "I think our culture, our society, has put itself above all living creatures, creating needs purely to support destructive economic practices. This tree doesn't require an Apple Watch. It doesn't stream its favorite shows or have a microwave oven, pay health insurance, or drink grande iced caramel macchiatos. It is just a tree, but you rarely see geese riding jet skis or wearing designer clothing either. I think if we all want breathable air and drinkable water, we all need to learn how to live with less," end quote. With the emphasis on we all need to learn how to live with less. Well, if we all need to learn how to live with less, this is a chance for Brian to prove that, to show that, right? And he also sort of has the best incentive to continue proving it, because his life may literally depend on him succeeding in hiding away from law enforcement. In a recent interview with a high school pal of Brian's, we find additional reinforcement for who Brian really is, for why he's likely not going to be found anytime soon, and for where he may be ultimately. And I'll put a link to that article from The Sun in the description. So let's get to the first point, and that is we kind of get to know another Brian, who was described by a school pal as a heavy-set social outcast, which I think is politically correct language for a fat loser or a sort of fat kind of reject, someone who was just not part of the in crowd at school. And so if you take that description and ask, well, which character would that suit in Fight Club? How about Fight Club's Meatloaf? In the previous episode, I brought up Brian and Gabby's independence, or rather lack of. I do think in a certain sense Brian was more independent than Gabby. Brian was used to being alone, for example, and perhaps being the sort of character we see in Fight Club, a loner, an outcast, perhaps even a loser. I'm not saying he liked that role, just that he was used to it, and so he could endure loneliness for an extended period. Gabby, on the other hand, seemed less able to tolerate loneliness or being on her own. And so a quote from the article reads, he added that Brian was an intelligent and independent student who tended to keep to himself. And so anyone who tends to keep to themselves know how to entertain themselves, know how to occupy themselves, and they're not going to have difficulty spending an extended period out of the view of the public. Does that make sense? Now, although I believe Brian is fairly independent, certainly in the loner sense, certainly in the social sense, I'm not sure I believe he was totally independent, because if he was, he wouldn't be living with his parents, and he wouldn't have made a beeline for home immediately after the incident in Wyoming, right? It's possible, as I've said before, that the way to find Brian is not by looking for him. Instead, follow the breadcrumbs, digital and otherwise, to someone, possibly a family member, on whom he is relying, depending for money and perhaps other resources such as shelter, etc. I also think the outcast scenario means that Brian is more comfortable simply not being a participant in society, right? Society doesn't seem to like him, and the feeling appears to be mutual. Brian's high school pal also said in an interview, quote, Brian has a fascination for art, specifically drawing, and enjoyed science fiction movies, end quote. Now, I am going to, in the ongoing thing, sort of diving deep into the psyche of Brian, the psychological life of Brian via Ernest Becker. We're going to look at this, the creative solution, how someone sees life as a problem and then tries to solve it through art, through expressing themselves in a particular way. I'm going to deal with that in more detail, but not in this particular episode. But I do think it's very interesting that both Brian and Gabby were artists. And I think it also remains to be seen which one of the two were better artists. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if right now a lot of Brian's time has been spent doing all of those things mentioned by his school pal. So his school pal talks about a fascination for art, especially drawing, and then he enjoys science fiction movies. Well, isn't that what Brian has been doing this past month? Quietly scratching on pieces of paper or canvas, perhaps making liner cuts here and there, watching movies between watching for news of the fruitless search for him and the series of bogus sightings reported on some YouTube channels, which I think also suits him quite well. I think it suits him that bogus sightings are brought up here and there, because it delegitimizes, or it places less credibility. Every bogus sighting means the next sighting is sort of treated with distrust, and overall the interest in him then starts to wane, right? I think the more bogus sightings, the better the chance people may overlook him if he ever chooses to step out for some fresh air. again, if Brian is a character in Fight Club, or if there was a character that resonated with him, who do you think it might be? And that brings us to the second point, where the high school friend describes him as an effective planner. And this is another quote from the article. Quote, "From a young age, Laundrie had been a good planner and can execute his plans in exactly the way he wants. I think he'd be able to put the resources together to get out of the country, either illegally or under some sort of fake identification," the friend told The Sun. "He's the type of person that would be able to drop everything to secure his means of not being captured and to evade arrest or evade prosecution from what seems to be a pending crime." End quote. Do you think this fugitive phase has been planned well and executed well? The school friend described him as a guy who plans effectively and executes effectively. Well, would you say at this point in time that the fugitive phase has been planned well and executed well? Whatever you answer to that, the most wanted man in America, whatever his plan or non-plan seems to be, he does seem to be succeeding at whatever he's playing at. It seems more likely to me that he's operating intuitively and counterintuitively than randomly. In other words, it seems like that there is strategy here, there is planning here, there is an idea or a concept, and then the execution of it. I do think Brian expected authorities to suspect that he was at the reserve, especially with the Mustang parked there, as if to shout, "Look for me here." But was it left there intentionally to mislead as part of a plan, or left there randomly? Well, wouldn't you agree the authorities have been misled and have been led on a wild goose chase for over a month? In terms of the point that he could put resources together and get fake identification and get out of the country, consider Brian's exit out of Wyoming. Number one, he got resources together, meaning Gabby's van. Two, he used Gabby's card fraudulently, and you could argue that that was getting resources as well. And three, he got out of the state. So was Brian's exit out of Wyoming haphazard or planned and executed? And did he head to Florida because he wanted to get out of Florida, or because he wanted to begin the first phase of hiding out in familiar territory? And that brings us to the third point, the country Brian was talking about a lot. So once again, we're going to refer to a quote from the article in The Sun. Quote, "Laundrie and the friend would have conversations about places they would like to see and countries they would like to live in one day. Brian's favorite film director is Neil Blomkamp, who created Chappie, Elysium, and District 9, end quote. So, first of all three of those movies already tell you a lot about Brian. All three movies deal with outcasts, aliens, and fugitives of the system. If you haven't seen those movies, I have seen all three of them, and I've actually seen all three of them quite recently for a second or third time. But if you haven't seen them, you probably want to watch them to get a sense of this this society that is intimidating and unfriendly and unkind. And you also get a sense that it's an unjust society, and then these interlopers to the society, these outcasts who actually bring a sense of humanity to the story and to these inhuman societies. Going back to the article, quote, "Blomkamp is from South Africa," the friend said. That's a country that Brian was talking about a lot because that was one of his favorite genres of movies. And two of the three movies took place in South Africa, end quote. Well, the one movie that didn't take place in South Africa, Elysium, does actually feature a South African, and the bounty hunter in that movie flies in a kind of a space vehicle with a South African flag on it. So that is definitely, I guess, part of his Brian's sort of fandom. But I don't think I need to tell you that South Africa is almost on the other side of the world if you're in America. It's not quick or easy to get to. It's a long haul. Even if Brian would like to end up here, it's very, very unlikely he's anywhere near the southern hemisphere after just 36 days on the run. And that brings us to the penultimate point, number 4. But where is he now? I wouldn't be surprised if Brian is still in Florida, still fairly close to home, probably or possibly in a suburb, basically camping, but camping indoors. He may even be in a suburb in or near Northport. Perhaps he orders food in, or perhaps food is periodically brought to him. Follow the money, and I think you'll likely find a less outdoorsy Brian than you've been led to believe. And that brings us to the 5th and final point, why Brian will likely not be found anytime soon. And if you think back to the sort of early days of the hunt for Brian Laundrie, there was sort of talk that someone was closing in on Brian, and you kind of got the sense that any minute now Brian's going to be found. Well, I don't think that is the case. That hasn't been the case for the past few weeks, and that is, I think, likely to remain the case for the medium term, for the foreseeable future. Why? Because more than a month has passed with actually 0 clues, 0 leads, and 0 actual sightings. It's also possible that Brian has help, and that's definitely going to assist him to remain missing, to remain invisible, if that is the case. And so a month without leaving any clues behind, that's not bad. In China, in just the last couple of days, there was a manhunt in China, and I think that fugitive remained on the run for just 2 weeks. So Brian's already doing a lot better than that, as the most hunted man in America. If Brian, wherever he is, can keep up what he's doing and not doing, he can possibly stretch out his winning streak to 2, 3, even 6 months. The longer he's on the run, the more the alternatives that are open to him, the choices that'll be open to him, multiply. His appearance will change by itself. Seasonal changes may also play into assisting his subterfuge. I saw a detective saying that the change in seasons will flush him out of the Appalachian Trail, but that's if he's somewhere on the Appalachian Trail. Think about the other side of things, hurricanes coming and going, and that can also clear the coast, so to speak, for certain intervals. I think the only real question then is about resources. Where and how is he getting money for food? Long term, the most wanted man in America is probably going to want to be somewhere else besides America. So long term, I can't really see how Brian would want to remain in America. It would be too risky. And in that sense, South Africa isn't a bad option longer term. Flying is the best way to get far from Dodge, but it's a dangerous option because he'll need to get through customs, in and out, undetected. There's also the risk of being recognized by his fellow passengers, especially if they're Americans. But longer term, getting here may be possible for an intelligent planner who can show initiative and resolve, who's perhaps not afraid of being a little bit uncomfortable for an extended period. So, for example, one can stow away in a container and have the container on a container ship. One relatively cheap, easy way would be to work aboard or stow aboard some of the huge tankers and cargo ships that regularly head down to the southern Atlantic and around Cape Point. And so that is if he's intending to go to South Africa. So if he ever gets this far, if he ever gets all the way to South Africa, I think Brian will be as good as gone. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.